Let's just kick off. Welcome everyone to what is my final event of the Conservative Home programme at Party Conference. Of our 40 events, my first time in the ConservativeHome marquee. I'm really grateful to you all for coming because we're about to discuss a project that's quite close to my heart, which is the ConservativeHome project and the idea more broadly of reducing demand for government. It does require just a bit of explanation. So the Conservative Party must be continuously in a state of renewal, whether it's heading towards another term in government or opposition, wherever it is. So we wanted to do a project that would help in what I think is now called the thought leadership. And we wanted to begin with something that most party members would agree with, which is broadly that in our present condition, government is too big, taxes are too high, civil society is too weak. Right? All that is easily said. So last year, there was an experiment in cutting taxes without cutting the supply of government. And I don't think it worked especially well. So if you can't cut taxes without cutting the supply of government, I think it's also become evident it's very hard to cut the supply of government until you've cut the demand for it. So how do you do that? Well, one answer is this. If you take a kid and the kid grows up in a happy family, good school, productive work, that kid's probably, not certainly, probably more likely to have a happy life, which is the most important thing. But there will also be a saving for the taxpayer and a diminution in the size of government, because that kid is less likely to make demands on youth offending, probation, prison, debt counselling, substance abuse, all of that, mental health counselling, even the NHS, all the stuff that runs up bills. Now, all this is not a panacea, but it is maybe a start. So just finally, what we are not trying to do is to produce a manifesto with pledges, although we've produced a series of essays in the last few weeks. We're a bit more like chemists in a laboratory who are experimenting with finding the right mix before someone else, that's the politicians later down the line, package up the product and try to sell it. Now, we've got a first-class panel, and I will introduce them one by one. And I'm going to go first to Michael Gove, and I feel just a little sense of trepidation in doing so, because I don't know anyone who's better at taking a helicopter view of policy, and I rather feel that I'm putting our homework in front of a kindly but exacting head teacher. Okay. So, Michael, over to you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. Well, I think you're asking the right question. Can I first of all apologise for being late? I was waylaid by my friend Nick Robinson from the Today programme, and one of the things that I want to do is to reduce the demand for broadcasting as well as reducing for government. I won't say more about the BBC at this stage. Others may. I think that Paul identified things absolutely correctly. There is an ever-expanding and ever-increasing demand for government to take risk away in all of our lives. And I'll return to the question of risk in a moment. But just a few particular thoughts. How do you reduce the demand for government? Well, first of all, I think Paul is absolutely right. Education, and even before we get to school, early intervention in families that are facing real difficulties. So, social workers, not necessarily people whom any Conservative conference audience would necessarily think of as our principal allies, but we need to get social work right, and I can expand on some of the problems that we have in social work, in order to ensure that we're intervening early in families, in order to both ensure that families stay together wherever possible, but also where children are genuinely at risk, that they're taken out of situations where they're at risk of abuse or neglect, because the cost will only spiral later if they are not found an appropriate adoptive, or preferably adoptive, or in extremis foster home in due course. So the first thing that I would do is stress that in social work, one of the key problems is social work education leads people to the conclusion that difficult and troubled families are the victims of socioeconomic circumstances rather than agents who can shape their own lives. Effective social work is about giving people that sense of responsibility back, so they recognise their responsibility to their children and to each other. And for those of you who want to know more about this, Martin Nary's work on how to reform social work education is critical. School itself, again, how we reduce the demand for government is, I'm afraid, and please forgive me for reprising lessons from the past, is by concentrating on teaching people those essential subjects that give them the greatest chance to choose their destiny. And instead of being the plaything of economic forces beyond their control, they become authors of their own life story. I got it in the neck when I was Education Secretary for stressing the importance of English, mathematics, science, history or geography, and foreign languages. But the reason I did that is that those of you who may be fortunate enough to have been educated privately or to send your children to independent schools will know that those are the subjects that universities and employers value most. I was accused of being sort of, scornful of other creative subjects and all the rest of it. What I wanted to do was to ensure that people at 16 or 18 had the chance to make a choice for themselves of the sort of high-paying job or the degree or other course that would lead to a high-paying job, which is critical for making sure that they can become economically and financially independent. Paul also mentioned the cost of social failure and in particular crime. I think, again, two things here, two basic conservative rules. Zero tolerance policing. I know it's a cliche, but it's absolutely correct. The Home Secretary is right to say, for example, that every investigable crime should be investigated. Once you start retreating in the public square, once you start allowing limited crime and disorder, once you do as the Scottish Government has said, and say that below a certain threshold you will not investigate theft and so on, then that is the road to ruin. And actually, to be fair, here in Manchester, as the Home Secretary has pointed out, Greater Manchester Police are dealing effectively in the Cheetham Hill area with what had become an encrusted and embedded level of crime, and they are at last reversing this programme of defining deviancy down, which has been a problem throughout in policing. But linked to that, we also need effective prison reform, because we need to make sure that when people are in the care of the state, ineluctably as they have to be when they're in prison, that we ensure that they get the education, the training, the time out of their cell and the time acquiring skills that will mean that on release, instead of being drains on society, instead of being liabilities, they can become assets. I'll mention two other areas as well, which have fallen within or fall within my purview. Housing. The more effectively we can build more homes, the more effectively we can reform the supply of housing, the easier we make it for people to become home owners, the less we need to ensure that the inevitable costs of providing other alternatives in order to ensure that people are leading a stable life, the better. And critically, the more homes we build and the bigger the homes we build, the easier it is for people to raise families. So I know there's sort of all sorts of big arguments about demography, population, and all the rest of it. But the biggest inhibitor to people having the family that they want is that they can't get the home that they need, and that needs to change. Finally, on the environment, again, the principle of early intervention matters. Cleaning up environmental despoliation is far more costly than intervening, particularly with nature-based solutions, early on in order to ensure that we don't suffer the costs of pollution. So everything from holding water companies to account for their treatment of wastewater, through to making sure that we restore nature, through to shifting farming subsidies away, as we have, from simply the size of a farm estate towards environmental goods. All of these things are investments in ensuring that we don't have the cost of pollution later down the line. And everything that I've outlined, supporting the family, and making sure that social workers are there to give people a sense of proper agency rather than feeling they're victims, an education which is based on rigour and choice, a crime policy which does not tolerate any law-breaking, an approach towards prison that regards the time when someone is in the care of the state as time to be purposeful rather than to be warehoused, a housing policy that stresses ownership and family, and an environmental policy that stresses prevention, early intervention, and nature. All of these are conservative principles, and they will all be the handmaidens of a smaller state and a greater level of personal autonomy that I think all of us on this panel want to see.
Thank you very much. Great introduction. Next, I'm going to welcome Laura Trott. Laura has a serious interest in policy, and unless you have that, you don't become pensions minister, which is what she currently is. And also, of course, she's serving in a department where getting people into work and keeping people in work is central to their mission. So, Laura, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thank you for convening this discussion. I think it's worth pausing for a second to think about the manifesto that Mike and I were elected on, that Lord Frost was elevated to Cabinet to deliver. That was all about expanding the state, right? More doctors, more nurses, more police officers, and it was incredibly popular. There is no public mandate to slash public services. People want better public services. They don't want less of them. But we're Conservatives. We want lower taxes when inflation is dealt with. And we have to pay for those. And we saw what happened when we don't do that. We need to make sure that any tax cuts we do are fully funded. Anyone who argues the opposite, it should be within the Labour Party and consigned to their magical thinking. They have no place in the Conservatives. So how do we square that circle? I think the work that Paul and ConHome have done provides a lot of the answers. Work absolutely has to be at the foundation of this. We know that jobs provide people with better health outcomes. It means that you're less likely to have family breakdown because economic insecurity is one of the leading causes of that. And it also means that you're less likely to rely on the state. You can have self-reliance, which as Conservatives is what we want to be promoting. I did some media yesterday, and I was talking about the sanctions announcement that the Chancellor made in his speech, and I was asked if this was the Conservatives being the nasty party again. And I cannot refute that more strongly. Work and getting people the dignity of a job is what conservatism is all about. The soft bigotry of low expectations that Michael has spoken about so frequently before applies to condemning people to a workless household. It's been one of the main ways we've lifted children out of poverty and that we've reduced poverty in this country since 2010. We should be proud of it, and it's something that we should be promoting. The second thing, I think, in terms of reducing the demand on the state is exactly as Michael outlined. There are lots of calls to increase funding for schools, for hospitals, for GPs, but that's because there are people that use those every day. There are fewer people in this room, I would expect, who have had experience of children's social care, who have been through rehabilitation. But those things are absolutely vital to reduce demand on the state overall. Unless you are in a situation where you haven't got a quarter of prisoners who currently come from a care background, you're not really going to change that £46,000 cost that keeping people in prison every year dictates. The same as reoffending. The reoffending rate is coming down, but it's still over 20%. It's 50% for people on sentences of 12 months or less. It's too high. We need to change that, and in order to do that, we need to place emphasis on those services that aren't necessarily used every day, that aren't the big lobby groups for. We need to make them popular. We need to explain why they're so important, as Michael so rightly outlined just then. I want to say a word about families, and families I know is a big part of the work that ConHome did. It is important that we as Conservatives are behind families. We are the party of families, but it must be families of any structure. We must not do anything to stigmatise single mothers, to say that a woman should stay at home and shouldn't be able to go out to work. We need to provide her with the money and the childcare that is provided in order to do that. We must not put a single barrier in place to mean that a woman fleeing domestic violence is less able to leave her marriage. Those are really important. We must be pro-family, but it must be families of all types. We have to embrace modern Britain. We can't be seen as on the other side of it. The last point I wanted to make was around just efficiency of the state. Now, I used to be Frances Maude's special advisor, and in 2010, we did the very unglamorous work of just cutting billions of pounds out of government spending through efficiency. Now, Frances Maude is a great man, and he was uniquely suited to the back-breaking and honestly, quite boring work many times of just making sure that we got government spending down. But we need to do that. We need to have that focus on government efficiency, because if ministers don't care about it, civil servants won't either. And we really need to make sure that every penny that we are putting out of government is spent in the best way. And that means focusing on civil service headcount. It means focusing on making sure the HR numbers in departments aren't really high, that we're doing procurement. Like I said, very unglamorous, but definitely something that needs to be done. And we are, known as good custodians of the public purse. We need to keep that reputation. So thank you, Paul, for convening this discussion. I think it's really important. And I think what we need to do is focus relentlessly on work, to focus on those public services which don't always get the press that they should, to make sure that we're embracing families of all forms, and to make sure we're spending public money very well.
Thank you very much. Next, I want to turn to one of the country's most able spokesmen for lower spending in a small state. That's David Frost, former Brexit negotiator under Boris Johnson, former cabinet minister. David, welcome very much. I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to ConHome for doing the work you've done over the last 2 to 3 months on reducing the demand for government. It's certainly been really interesting. It's definitely made me think a bit as I've read the contributions. Well, just a few points, perhaps, reacting to what's been said already. I think I do have, maybe begin by saying, I think I do have a philosophical difference with, to some extent at least, with what Michael and Laura said. And I think it's about means maybe rather than ends. I would certainly, I mean, we would all want to live in a society where the things that have been described were the situation. That would definitely be best. I think I have a sense of the state's natural limitations in achieving those goals when it tries to achieve them, maybe. And it certainly worries me that when the state does try to achieve these social goals, they tend to expand over time because the state is not very good at it, generally. But it is always able to say, well, if we just could have a bit more power or a bit more money, maybe we could do it a bit better. So there's a ratchet to sort of increase the size of spending, increase the scope of state involvement. And it tends to expand over time unless you see a really rigorous pushback against it. So I think that is my sort of philosophical worry with the active state, as it were, or the case that says if we can spend now, act now to make things better later. I think what often tends to happen is we just do the spending and the getting on things better later is indefinitely deferred. So that's my kind of philosophical worry, I suppose. Just 2 or 3 other quick points. One, we are in a very collectivist society at the moment, and it's certainly from the British social attitude polling is clear that there has been a move towards collectivism in the last 5 or 6 years. However, if you look at the full time series of that polling, going back to the 80s, it's clear we've always been extremely collectivist in attitudes in broader society, slightly less so in the Major and Blair period, but only slightly. Overwhelmingly, people have believed things about the state and government and its role in society that most Conservatives probably don't philosophically believe. And I think we've just got to accept that for the time being. I don't think that powerful arguments are going to change these very deep-seated attitudes, except over a very long period. What I take from that polling is that people are persuaded by results. When we did have a smaller state, when taxation was coming down, when there was a bit more freedom, the attitudes changed. Not dramatically, but they did change in the 80s and 90s. So you have to deliver results. And I draw the conclusion from that you need to shrink supply. You can't hope to shrink the demand, except maybe in the very long run with a very powerful argument. So what does that mean for political strategy. I think it means we have to fight on values which are not only those of economics. Politics is about values, it's about the nation, it's about all kinds of things at the moment, and Conservatives need to fight on those as well as pure free markets and the size of the state. And we need to, of course, we need to make the case. We need to use events and actual reality to prove that a smaller state and lower taxation are better, but don't expect quick change on these things. We're fighting on unpropitious territory, I fear, and we've got to accept that in the way we develop our arguments and try to win.
Just finally then, Nick Timothy, and I've followed Nick on his journey from being Theresa May's special advisor, ConservativeHome columnist, so we like to think we could have launched you into the world of journalism, Chief of Staff in Downing Street, and now Conservative candidate for West Suffolk. Many congratulations on getting the nomination. And I've known you say that the centre of political gravity is that the British voters lean culturally a bit to the right, economically a bit to the left. And that's not always a bad place for the Conservative Party to be. So having set that framework for you, welcome, and let's see what you have to say.
Well, thank you. I think that sometimes that approach is nicknamed love the NHS, hang the pedos. And we should be more than capable of, if not hanging, doing both of those things, I think. To me, the question we need to ask is, what do we think of the state? And what do we want the state for? So normally politics is an argument about the state versus the market, or state power versus freedom. I actually think that's the wrong way of looking at it. And we should think of state, community and market more of a partnership of three, where one actually reinforces the other. So obviously, without a strong market economy, we're not going to have the prosperity for families to be strong and to help themselves. We're not going to have the tax receipts for the state to provide its services. Without a strong community, we don't have the social trust upon which our market economy relies. And without a strong state, then we obviously lose things like the rule of law, upon which everything stands. But also, I think, in parts of the country where we've lost a lot of social capital and a lot of civic confidence, we're sitting around waiting for the invisible hand, and the invisible hand may, in some places, be invisible because it's not there. And we might need the state to capacity build and catalyse and so on. But it is important, though, even if we do recognise that there's an important role for the state, that obviously the state doesn't get too big, because we know that the state can crowd out not only the innovation of the private sector and investment in the private sector, but it can also impede strong and healthy communities. So I think we want a state that is small, strong, strategic, and capable of catalysing and capacity building. We're in a context of an ageing society, which means there's going to be increased demand for public services provided by the state for years into the future through the health and social care systems, and for pensions too. There are, however, I think, some ways in which we can reduce demand for the state, reduce the size of the state quickly now. The civil service is broken. I'm not a minister, so it's easier for me to say it. But it is broken. I spent some time reviewing the Home Office earlier in the year. I ended that process more zealous than ever about civil service reform. My personal view is we need significant reductions in the size of the civil service. We need significant increases in what we pay people. We need significant powers for ministers to be able to hire people and for civil service leaders to sack people. We need to do something about the growth of quangos, which take upon lives of their own. Only today, the Migration Advisory Committee was making recommendations that asylum seekers should be able to work, which seems to be completely beyond the remit of the Migration Advisory Committee. I think we've quietly re-regulated large parts of our economy. I think a lot of that is done in the name of environmentalism. A lot of it has actually happened not actually because of the conscious decisions of ministers or of Parliament, but through the courts and the widening definition of different laws that have been agreed in the past. Laura mentioned the hard yards that you put in with Francis back during the coalition. I remember them well. I used to take quite a lot of inspiration from what you did when we were in the Home Office. There are 43 police forces in England and Wales. There are thousands of different police ICT systems, none of which are compatible with one another within forces and between forces. The difficulty police forces will always say is, well, the contracts run to different lengths and it's very difficult to try to bring them together. But the state is, frankly, a stupid buyer. We should be convening conferences of suppliers and state purchasers to...
Just shout louder.
This is my fifth Fringe conference, so I'm not sure I can shout louder. But I knew this would happen. Every summer, Manchester ruins a test series with constant rain, and it's doing its party conference. So we could be doing something much smarter with procurement, in quite boring terms, to try to bring together things like the end of contracts across different sort of counties or different parts of the state. We can end a lot of the displacement activity that the state does. Well, I can't fix the problem of crime, says the Mayor of London, but I will put up lots of posters telling you not to stare at people on the tube. And there's welfare policy. We did welfare reform earlier in our 13 years, but actually post-COVID we're probably going to have to do it all over again. So I think there are some ways in which actually we can get to work reasonably quickly on reducing the size of the state, but it's actually not quite as simple as that. And quite often it takes things like upfront capital investment to release efficiencies down the line. And sometimes, if you just cut the supply, you end up with more demand that actually you do end up needing to meet. And I say this, having spent 5 years in the Home Office, went in 2010 with a full head of hair, came out looking like this. We cut the policing budget by about a quarter, and crime fell by about a quarter in that time. So, it is possible to reduce spending, but if you, I think, just straightforwardly do it and expect demand to fall with it, then I think you end up with problems. If you talk to people across the public sector at the moment, the police will say, well, we're the emergency service of last resort because we're dealing with all these social problems to do with mental health, to do with social breakdown. If you speak to head teachers, they will say, we're the emergency service provider of last resort because we're dealing with all these social problems that the kids are bringing into school. And you speak to doctors and they will say exactly the same thing. And this is because of some of the failures of the state, some of which I think, I'm afraid, probably have been made worse by some cuts. In terms of tackling demand for the demand for the state rather than the supply, we're talking about pretty big and sometimes quite totemic and sometimes quite long-term changes. One of the things that has bothered me for a long time is the effects of care in the community, where if you spend any time in any urban environment, you will see profoundly troubled people, quite often reliant on alcohol abuse or drug abuse, who they're not living a free life. They're suffering quite badly, but they're also causing quite a lot of fear in the communities that they live in. And contributing to the loss of trust, which then in turn contributes to antisocial behaviour and crime. I think we could do something that is more humane and also better for society. It would be costly, but it would then later reduce costs downline because a large percentage of what the police do, for example, relates to this kind of failure. Laura mentioned families. I think that's completely right, and this is kind of what I mean, I think, about this relationship between the state, community, and market. What I mean by the capacity building and catalysing role of the state does not necessarily mean that the solutions need to be big government. I want to cite two examples that I think we could learn from across the board. Michael presided over the free schools revolution. Free schools were brilliant. Free schools would have been impossible without an organisation called the New Schools Network, which I later ran, but I can't claim credit for because it wasn't my idea, and therefore I can talk about how brilliant it was. The New Schools Network went out and found people and showed them how to do it. In communities that didn't have very much civic confidence, that was absolutely vital. The second example, I would say, is community sponsorship of refugees, which actually expanded to its fullest and most logical conclusion with the Homes for Ukraine scheme, where we weren't having asylum seekers crossing the channel and being put up in hotels and causing bottlenecks and crises in the provision of housing. It was done in an orderly fashion because communities themselves embraced the idea and welcomed people into their homes. Community can play quite a big role in solving many social problems and, in the end, reducing the demand for the state.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask the panel three mischievous questions, the first of which was, forget all this fancy stuff, why not just cut taxes? The second was, forget all this fancy stuff, why not just cut spending? And the third was, the state's bigger in France and Germany, doesn't seem to do them any harm. Shouldn't we drop all this totemic stuff about the size of the state? But it's your session, and we've only got 15 minutes. So unless they want to turn to any of those questions, I'm going to go over to you. So it's great that you're all here. I'll take the guy at the back there, and you, sir, in the green coat. Yeah.
Okay, definitely agree with everything Nick was saying about that tripartite relationship between community, the private sector and the state. So I represent cooperatives, which is a particular type of business which tries to be better at distributing power and wealth and opportunity through day-to-day business. And I wonder if we could hear a little bit more of that from the panel. Do you think one way to reduce the demand for government is to have an economy which is better at more efficiently sharing opportunity, wealth and power over the course of people's lives without the state having to get involved and clean up the mess? Cheers.
Great, thank you. And somewhere... That's right, yes.
Sorry. Michael, I know you talked about education, and you're clearly a very educated person. You worked in the Times, you sat through numerous editorial meetings, you know about geopolitics, you know about how governments work, how autocracies work. Looking at the question how we got here, can you tell us why the government refused to investigate Russian interference in British politics?
Do you want to deal with that quickly, and then we'll talk about wealth and power?
I'm not aware that the government has refused to investigate Russian interference in British politics, and we are taking and have taken action, obviously, against a number of individual actors, oligarchs, by sanctioning them and by, as some of them have complained, essentially making sure that they can't enjoy their assets in this country. So I'm not aware of any lack of attention or energy in dealing with it. But as ever, if you have any evidence that you'd like to bring to the attention of the authorities, then please do.
And, sorry, we must go on. The question on wealth and power, anyone?
Laura knows a lot about cooperatives because of the fantastic work that Francis did there. So I hope this isn't a hospital pass.
No, not at all. Yeah, we did actually quite a lot of work back in 2010 on mutuals, which is spinning out bits of the public sector to form cooperatives, which were fantastically successful, actually, and gave people a real stake and ownership. It's a fundamentally conservative principle, right, that if people feel like they have control over what's happening to them, have control over organisations, they're much more invested in them. It's something that I'd like to see more of now, and the work that you're doing sounds great.
Anyone else, or should we'll move on? There are a lot of hands. The gentleman there right at the back, and here right at the front. So why not?
Thank you. I'm Councillor Gurcharan Manku from Slough. Gurcharan Manku from Slough. Thank you. Right. Anyway, so we believe in smaller government, and as long as it leads to better productivity, more efficiency, right? But if it leads to chaos right? And ungovernable departments, do you think that will be worth it? Or how do we achieve smaller governments? Or it is just to reduce the number of cabinet ministers or bureaucrats? So how do we do that? Right? That's my question. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And
I'm BJ from High Wycombe. Social Democrats will always have the poor to worry about. But given the UK's history with class and expectations of, class deference and expectations of industrial philanthropists, shouldn't the Conservative Party concentrate on wealth generation so we can pay for what people expect? And this sort of Dr. Beeching attitude to social ills, why aren't we more creative? Say, abolish pensions. There's £6 trillion of pensions. We don't have a pyramid. We don't have a lot of young people to pay pensions. Just roll it into universal credit, and the people and tax it 40%. That gets rid of the national debt, and the rich. You give back money to rich people to spend as they want. Let's be more creative rather than this sort of attitude from the 1960s.
okay, let's do the pensions things first. Roll pensions into UC.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are modern, compassionate Conservatives. It has to be a state that works for everyone, where you are free and given self-responsibility, and you are able to set up businesses, and you have fundamental freedoms in how you live your life. But we must always protect the poorest in our society. It's a duty of any compassionate government to do that, and that is why what we were talking about earlier in terms of children's social care, those type of services, that's why they have to be so good, because we have to look after those who are least able to look after themselves. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not encouraging businesses, that you're not trying to reduce the size of the state, reduce taxes. It's just you need to do those basic services well, because otherwise you don't have a society which is delivering for everyone, and you won't get buy-in for it. And it's important that we as Conservatives build the case for conservatism. We can't just assert something and just say, therefore, we want this to be true, therefore it is. We have to make sure that we are bringing people with us, and the only way to do that is to make sure that we are helping the poorest at the same time as helping everyone else to succeed. On pensions particularly, I think people also have to be bought into the state, right? Like, they work their lives, they pay their national insurance, and they get something out at the end, right? That is collectively something that I think we've accepted. It's also really important in terms of pensioner poverty, and to make sure that we are making sure those who have contributed to our society their whole lives get something out at the end. Now, the state pension is the basis for people's retirement. It's not the entirety of people's retirement for most people. And it's really important. Whenever I talk about pensions, I talk about private pensions as well as the state, because people need to be building up their private pensions. And I can talk to you for a long period of time, that probably Paul would start shouting me about the change that we've had in pensions. People used to have a defined benefit pension in the 1990s, guaranteed by their employer, 20% employer contributions. That's totally changed without too much public debate. So I think but the heart of what you're saying is that there must be a role for the state to help the poorest. It's crucial to the functioning of our society and to buy-in for any political project that we have.
Okay, next. David Frost, small government means chaos. Discuss.
I think we have lost confidence in anyone other than the state or state institutions to deliver social goals. And in the past, such goals were not always delivered by the state. This is something that has kind of grown on us after the war, 50s, 60s and 70s. And once you start, as I said at the start, once you start going down that road, it's quite difficult to get off the tram line. So I don't think a small government means chaos. I think it means accepting that social goals may in some areas need to be fulfilled in a different way, and it means accepting realistically that government gets a lot of things wrong as well and delivers poor services in a ineffective way just as it happens when it's not government. So I don't always think we're comparing like with like here. There's an assumption that the government always gets it right in delivering these services, which is not sort of borne out. Can I just make one other point, which is that I think we're reaching the point where the tax base that we have simply will no longer support the aspirations we've got for the kind of public services we want to do all these wonderful things. And it would be great if it was, but it isn't. And in the state of where we are at the moment, while we have such low rates of productivity growth and of growth, we're simply not going to be able to deliver everything else we want unless we solve that problem. If it was going well, things would be different. As it isn't, I think our priority is getting the economy growing again, rather than worrying about the detail at the margins of every single service that government provides.
Anyone else? Or two more? We'll have two more. The gentleman there, right here, and here. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Tom Scottson from ConservativeHome. Jake Berry told an event yesterday that 130 Conservative colleagues had ruled out voting for more tax increases. Do you think that's the right way to go about it for Conservative colleagues to reduce the demand for government?
Hello, my name's Brian Weller. How much can we get more outsourcing and competition into public services and bureaucracy whilst keeping standards, inspections and data protection free at the point of provision?
That's a good. Who wants to do outsourcing in public services? Because we've not, in the project, got into public services, and public service reform is a big Conservative theme. Michael?
One of the things that we have to be wary of is I absolutely agree to diversity of people providing services, but there is a challenge, which is that there are companies, and they do a good job in their own right, but there are companies, I won't name them, that do tend to specialise in hoovering up public sector contracts. And that's because those public sector contracts have been over-engineered, designed in an overcomplicated way. And you have these companies which, rather than saying, we're a company that provides security and we're experts in security, or we're a company that provides back-office computer services and we're an expert in that, they're experts in navigating the path towards procurement success. And so the first thing that we need to do, which indeed Jeremy Quinn and others are doing, is to reform the procurement process overall. And then the other thing also is that sometimes you find that some of the companies that are most anxious to work for government are also some of the companies whose ESG and EDI ambitions would make even Sadiq Khan consider himself a reactionary. So I think we have to be careful. There are lots of very good organisations that can help us, and I'll just say two things. Particularly what I think we can do, and I know it sounds like a sort of cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. We can make better use of tech. There are companies which are, particularly in the AI and the data analytics world, capable of transforming how public service, or certainly improving how public services operate. One company, again, I won't name it, it would be unfair, was brought in by Chelsea and Westminster Hospital to look at why the waiting lists were so long in Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. They discovered that different parts of the hospital maintained different waiting lists. Some of the people on those waiting lists were now better. Some of them were dead. But the information simply hadn't been shared because of the baronies within one hospital. I'm not even talking about more broadly. But I'll just mention two other things. So I hope that's helpful. The point about
tact pledge.
Oh yeah, I'll come back to that. To the gentleman here, though, I didn't respond earlier. I profoundly disagree with you. When you said, the poor will always have social democrats. People on the left let down the poor. That's the whole point. The reason why I'm a Conservative is that I believe in helping the poorest in our society, and the most effective way to do so is through Conservative policies, through encouraging self-discipline, thrift, educational ambition and all the rest of it. The left want to treat people as the flotsam and jetsam on socio-economic tides, incapable of exercising agency. I want to liberate people to exercise agency over their lives. So I completely reject your view. And the other thing also is, you know, if you say, oh, you know, you're being sentimental, well, I am sentimental. I am my brother's keeper. I do have a responsibility to other people in this country. We're a national community. And the whole point about being conservatives is that you don't worship or celebrate wealth. Worshipping and celebrating wealth on its own means raising up vulgarity, ostentation and greed above beauty, humility and the common life of all. So I completely reject your point of view.
Okay, you've had your go. Michael has very much had his go. And I'm still curious about this question about this tax burden for it that looked to me like one of these guns people wave around without necessarily intending to pull the trigger. But Nick?
Well, I mean, look, I think one of the themes of this week and the various conversations I've been having with people is that we keep talking about particular subjects which are actually the symptom of deeper problems. So I was talking to somebody earlier who said, should we have ever allowed arm to be sold? And I think the answer is no, we shouldn't have. But the question is a bit deeper. So why do British-based companies struggle to access the capital they need because of the state of our capital markets? Should HS2 go ahead in its fullest original vision, or should it not? Well, actually, the bigger question is, why the hell are we so crap at building these things? Why does it cost so much? And you know, in large part, this is because we've re-regulated parts of our economy. We do consultation really badly. Our planning system doesn't work in the way that it should. There's a bunch of people running a thing called Britain Remade, which is trying to promote ways in which we might actually get some infrastructure built, which I heartily endorse. And actually, you know, we're talking about the size and the role of the state and whether it takes up too much of the economy. One of the reasons we are in this predicament and talking about it in these terms is because we haven't had enough growth over the last 15 years since the financial crash and Great Recession that followed it. So, you know, we as a party can say since 2010 our economy has grown by 21%. We've grown the third fastest in the G7 ahead of France and Germany and Italy and Japan. And that's all true. But actually, when you think about the levels of growth on a per capita basis, it's not good enough. And when that happens, everything gets more expensive. It's much harder. So this is a debate for another day. But you know, one of the things we're doing again is talking about symptoms of a deeper problem.
I'm afraid there's lots that can and will be debated on another day, but the clock has run down and we're out of time. And I have to apologise to you twice. First is that we couldn't go on for longer, and second is that because we can't go on longer, some of you are going to have to go out in the rain. It's just our bad luck. Thanks, fantastic performance by Michael and David and Laura and Nick, who put a lot of thought into what they did. But I'm really especially grateful to you all for coming on a rainy Tuesday evening near the end of conference, when everyone has been very busy and working very hard. Thank you all very much, and thank the panel.
Thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you.